So yes, welcome everybody. And so, like I said, we're going to be going through social change advocacy, sexual harassment, and policies and procedures today. All right, next slide, please. So we're going to start out with, and we didn't make it a poll. You guys can either speak to us through your speaker or utilize the chat, but we wanted to hear from you all and see what have you always wanted to learn more about. And this is a huge, broad question. Maybe it's sewing. Maybe it's more about your tradition ceremonies. Maybe it's fishing. I don't know,
Hey,
just one
Stephanie.
thing. Yep.
Sorry, this is the interpreter. Sorry to interrupt. Would you mind spotlighting me? I don't seem to have that ability.
Hmm. I'm sorry.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, wait, hold on. I pinned you. Is that the same thing?
No, I don't even see the co-host on mine for some reason. I don't know why.
How strange. I made you a co-host, but let me double check. Let me make sure before we get going, everybody, that I'm. Can another co-host spotlight Amber, please? Because now that hold on. Here we go.
And me too.
Is that Hercules?
Good morning. Yes, it is.
Morning. All right. People are still entering too, so that's fine. I'm going to make you a co-host. Can you spotlight yourself now, Hercules?
Yes, I will be able to.
Okay, perfect. All right, we're good to go? Okay. All right. So I see some people putting stuff in chat, beading, sewing. And we have some soil health. I love that. Plant medicine and traditional archery. I would love to learn more about plant medicine too. Maureen says cultural protocol and traditions. Equine therapy, yes. I love that. I know some people that are doing that. Beading, traditions, ceremonies, how to advocate for or with a survivor if they absolutely don't want to report and don't share any details, but you know something happened. Thank you. We are touching on some of that too, so that's awesome. Plant medicine. So it seems like plant medicine might be the winner here. I totally agree. And just another reminder that the things that we're talking about, as you know, can bring things out in you. And so it can activate you. It can, this is hard work and it's hard discussion. And so don't forget to rely on our four sacred elements. And that would be earth, water, fire, and air. So smudge, ground yourself, get up if you need to. If you need to step outside and to ground, I mean, you're so open for that. We're not here to make sure you're sitting in front of the screen at all times. That's why we send out the recording. Do whatever it is that you need to do to keep yourself within your window of tolerance and to keep yourself safe. And yeah, so please rely on those. I have my Wakalapi, my coffee, my water, my smudge, and so that's kind of how I love to like get up and just walk away for a second if I need to. So please feel free to do that. And let's see. Maureen responded that she doesn't mind sharing how you do that as a program. I love that. So people are just kind of that peer-to-peer communication. I love that. We keep the chat and we keep things open here so that people can unmute and say what they are feeling. responding to each other like that in chat is amazing. Mindy, abuser rehabilitations and how we can get certified to teach those classes. So thank you everybody for participating on that first question. So just again, a reminder of 4 elements. And then also, next slide, Deb, please. Those interruptions of our habits that we talked about, those characteristics of white supremacy culture. So we are not here to be perfect. I hope you don't feel this sense of urgency. Sometimes I catch myself just as habit getting overwhelmed and trying to, that perfectionism side of me. I definitely love working at MUSAC because I think that we really push for that, making sure that we are being, so sorry, my dog, making sure that we aren't run by perfectionism. And my Great Dane does not care if we're having a meeting at all. And so, of course, quantity, right, over quality is not what we're here for. We'd rather spend our time doing the best that we can with, just relaying the information the best we can. And we're not here to just stick by the agenda, paternalism, either or thinking, power hoarding, fear of open conflict. And then, we want individualism. We want, or excuse me, we don't want the individualism. We're here as a group. And then that right to comfort. So I think that's that piece where we need to really rely on our elements and our tools that we've learned, is, that right to comfort. This is not these are not comforting conversations. These are real conversations that we're having and that we are talking about to better our, to strengthen our tools, to help other people, help our relatives. And so that is not always going to be comfortable. So just a little reminder of interrupting those habits and to breathe, right? So I will introduce Morgan again, and she is going to begin our next module here. So thank you, Morgan. I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thanks so much, Steph. Hello again, everyone, and those who I was not able to connect with or who weren't able to join in the last week session on Thursday. Welcome to you all. I'm Morgan Hawes. I'm the National TTA Sex Trafficking Program Coordinator for MUSAC, and it's an honor for me to be here to share and co-create this knowledge and this space of wisdom and transformation with you all. And I'm a member of the Picu Rancheria of Chukchansi Indians in Oakhurst, California, where I originally come from. And as my people say, Hili Hili. So thank you again for being here. And can we have the first slide, Deb? Thank you so much. So I ask that we center and ground ourselves before we proceed with talking about social change advocacy today and what that might look like in terms of changing social norms in our tribal communities. So if we can set our intentions for this session and really think about this as a space for us to connect and engage with one another with empathy and compassion. And remember that the space is for all, right? So the words that we speak, the ways that we express ourselves, they carry meaning. And if anyone's feeling activated, or if you need a break, as Steph already said, please take that time for yourself, whatever that space looks like for you. So what is social change advocacy? When we talk about social change advocacy, I think, it really sort of focuses on emphasizing how we engage our communities, how we listen to adults, children, elders, and how we identify problems, propose solutions, or think about the ways that we might want to come together in solidarity, right? To act on any sort of suggestions or solutions that we might have as a community. So, social change advocacy is really embedded in our everyday lives, right? It's part of all of the structures, the processes, the practices, and even just the ways we relate or interact with one another. And it intersects with the work that we do. So, whether that be work that's centered around trafficking, um, sexual violence, racial justice, diversity, uh, housing insecurity, mental health concerns like depression or anxiety, all of this is part of our life. And I think that there's been a lot of conversations that I've heard too about the impacts of COVID, right? And like post pandemic, how social change advocacy has really kind of developed and in some ways in certain spheres has kind of taken off or even just shifted, right? And what that looks like. And how we are sort of perceiving or viewing and navigating challenges, right, as we move forward. We've seen that, for example, we had a request recently to explore post-pandemic changes for advocates, folks who are a little bit more seasoned, so not necessarily like um, advocacy 101, but like how can we sort of position ourselves and focus on being proactive in the event that something happened that we don't anticipate, right? And that's sort of what we do as advocates is position ourselves to really support the needs, right, of survivors as we move through evolving and constantly changing landscapes and issues and solutions and all the things. So, thinking a little bit more, right, about this sort of how we're identifying and defining social change advocacy, part of what I also think about is news, how the news sort of reports information and how we consume that. So our interpretation of social change, and within that, like also our role as advocates, right? And sort of thinking about, you know, where like where can we see these changes taking place, whether those are at the local level, within our communities, the state, the federal level. Like the work that we do intersects with all of these different levels and processes, right? We're trying to disrupt and social change on all of these levels that we know impact the work that's being done directly to provide services to survivors and community members. I'm wondering if anyone can think of some examples of what they might see or perceive social change advocacy to be. And you guys can use the chat, please feel free, just throw a few things in there, whatever sort of comes to mind, but maybe some topics or thoughts that you might have, like what does social change advocacy look like to you in your community? Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for that, Kiki, right? Grassroots and community-led change. Absolutely. We're going to talk a little bit more about that too. Yes, thank you so much. Encouraging everyone to speak kindly to each other in community. Absolutely. That's so important, right? The ways that we come together and how we speak and use language to talk to each other. Yep, supporting people's big ideas while helping them formulate what baby steps we can take to help initiate that change. Absolutely. Yep. I agree with that too. That's so important. Yep, education for men and boys on toxic masculinity and changing narratives. For sure, definitely. Working to change social narratives that are harmful. Yeah, absolutely. helping to remove stigma by sharing our stories. Yes, thank you for that, Carrie. Right, because we know those stigmas become embedded, and almost sometimes I feel like the blame and shame that's connected to feeling like you maybe have an experience that fits into something people would stereotype is something that we carry with us. And how do we change that, right? So folks aren't carrying those stigmas, and that's not then coming in right to the work, but how do we sort of disrupt those? Yeah, even someone writing a letter to the editor in a local paper, yep, with a controversial, let me see if I can get subject, yep, in support of compassion, yep, can help people think differently, right? To rethink their prejudice. Absolutely. Thank you, Becky. Teaching boys and men that there is a difference between being a man and being abusive. Yes. Allowing traditional healing practices in all spaces. Yeah, talking circles with elders, sharing their stories. Yeah, thank you so much. That's powerful. I love this. Thank you for sharing. So we know that social change advocacy too, right? It sort of has a political element to it. We think about the impact of the wars that we've seen
Morgan, you're cutting out.
right impacts sort of overall levels. Uh-oh. Okay, is that better? Can
Yes.
you hear a little bit better, Steph?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Sorry about that. I'm I'm still here, but I'm in an area of poor reception. I apologize, everyone. So I was just saying that there's that political piece, right, that comes along with social change advocacy. So, things like reproductive justice and overturn of Roe v. Wade, that has an effect, right, on our communities, on our people, on folks who are seeking services. And that we also can participate in that type of advocacy and those changes. But at the end of the day, right, we get to decide sort of where we put our energy and our time and what are the projects or the topics, or where's our passion in terms of the type of advocacy or social change that we're really invested in as advocates and as people. So that doesn't mean that we have to have all the experience, but maybe it's an area that we hope to develop. And then that information, we bring that back in a meaningful and intentional way, and we contribute to those conversations, right? Like you guys have already highlighted those talking circles, right? With elders sharing the stories and the way that we transform like issues pertaining to men and boys, like this is all part of that, how we do social change advocacy. And so the question is, how do we identify and engage in social change advocacy in our tribal communities right now, currently, right? And the political and other types of environment that we are currently in. Debbie, you want to go to the next slide, please? So, looking at these goals and objectives, it's important to also highlight that they are constantly evolving, right? We can adapt them to our needs, but as issues emerge or change, so don't our goals and objectives for social change advocacy. What this looked like 30 or 40 years ago, different than what it looks like now. But also, there's the continuum, right? We're building off of the work of our aunties and our grandmothers, and we want to respect and value that and carry that forward with us, that momentum. So we know that this can change, especially when we're looking at sort of the intersections with local, community, state, and federal policy, and those relationships and intergovernment relationships, and also based on sort of the political climate, which we might not have a lot of control over, but certainly that impacts policy development, right? And the need sometimes becomes even more important, that need for social change advocacy, given that those political sort of values that we might have. And thinking a lot too about how tribal communities and governments interact with one another and address the needs of the survivors and community members. That evolves too, depending upon how we're able to educate and meeting people, the community in particular, where they're at, because some communities might not be as comfortable talking about certain subjects, right? We know that, we've experienced that. And as advocates, you're already doing social change work, right? You're using those passions that you have. You're bringing forward these issues that you see emerging with the survivors, and you're centering and uplifting those experiences and voices, right, in the community. So we're already doing the work. So our goal here, right, is to introduce advocates to social change advocacy. And the learning objectives for this session today will be to define social change and what that looks like in tribal communities. So how are we able to strengthen the movements that we really need in Indian country that might be invisible to other folks that we share space with in this work, but who do not intimately know the needs of our communities, right, or our people. And also gaining knowledge that will, again, strengthen that social change advocacy. So how can we come together to bring that visibility and awareness to the issues we know need to be brought forward? And who are our allies, right? So strengthening relationships too, being good relatives, and thanks, Steph. And leveraging these connections to others who share a passion in this work, because we need those allies also to understand the sort of things that are happening in our communities, and also how we might be able to utilize those relationships to really carve a path forward. And then so recognizing those social norms, right, that don't reflect our indigenous values, and then identifying alternatives that engage individuals, again, like allies, community, and institutions too, to better align with the values we have. So how do we creatively address issues like reproductive justice, like trafficking, like needs for shelters, LGBTQI2 spirit, and how do we collaborate and coordinate to create something diverse and inclusive? Debbie, do you want to go to the next slide? So what are social norms? Well, social norms are values, beliefs, attitudes, and actions, right, that become accepted. They become socially accepted when we say the term accepted here, and they are standards of behavior. So social norms are really heavily influenced by things like the internet, digital pathways that we live in, and these influence what social norms are and how they get developed, right? So these accepted standards of behaviors that sometimes cause us to choose sides. For example, I mean, actually, I wonder, do you guys have an example of this? Like when we think about sort of, in my mind, the word that comes up is kind of like we're splitting a little bit here, but like we talked, if some of you remember during the oppression presentation, we talked about the good and the bad, right? Like people who are put into these buckets, right? We're putting folks into these categories of, okay, like you're a collaborator, you're a resistor, right? We talked a lot about that. Can we think about ways that social norms will sort of group people into and have these like two sides, like this polarization is occurring? Do you guys have any thoughts or examples of what that might look like? As we know that exists in sort of groups and societies, and that this is like a learned behavior or observation that occurs. Yeah, like good versus bad, right versus wrong. I'm going to throw this out there, and you guys feel free to to say, what the heck? But do you remember back in the day, we were talking about this last week, Steph, that's why I'm going to put it out here, but someone said something about Twilight. You guys remember that movie? Yes, thank you, Tyrell. Body art. But it was like Team Edward, Team Jacob. It's just like it's where we sort of categorize people, right? Exactly. What's taboo? Like Britney Spears, right? Folks who are like Team Britney, and what does that mean, right? We know that there were some mental health concerns and other things, but like also what is autonomy and agency, and like how does that sort of fit into the consideration of folks who are carrying a legacy of trauma, or who are survivors of certain experiences or types of violence, and like how do we sort of balance, like, right, like this understanding of that, but also where can we advocate, right, like to disrupt and interrupt the creation, establishment, or just the perpetuation of these social norms, right? Yeah, clarifying what is taboo. Yeah, absolutely, Candace. So we see again, yep, the customs, taboo, like what does that mean? What is taboo? Biases, these things are changing, right? Yeah, thank you, Emily. So acknowledging and addressing forms of oppression of women's bodies, marching to protect our rights, yep, to our bodies and our health. This can be seen as outspoken or outside of societal norms. Yes, absolutely. We're going to talk a little bit about that language too that we use, right? So also, when we talk about ending violence, we're in a certain position, right, of privilege, where we understand like the acronyms that are used, you know, DVSA, and we understand this information and we can conceptualize it. But there might be folks in our communities who don't have this knowledge, right? It might not be uh, it's the same sort of general way of understanding for everybody. And also, we already mentioned a little bit about how some folks, you know, use of these terms, or having conversations about some of the issues that folks are experiencing itself, might be something that people can consider to be sort of taboo, and there are reasons for that. But the question is, how can we share and bring this information back to our communities, right? In a way where we can sort of come together in solidarity, but also be sort of intentional about that challenge of norms, while we're also respecting the process of co-creating that knowledge, right? And sharing that wisdom, and how that might be different for different folks, and also different in different communities, as some of these topics, like we said, might be less frequently discussed. So something I was thinking about is, you know, I've heard the term sort of best practices put out there a little bit, and folks have been sort of asking a lot about how do we develop or obtain access to what might be considered best practices. And I really see that as part of social change advocacy, actually, right? Like really thinking about like intuitively what, like, and also just respectfully, what are best practices, and how that might be and look and be different for every community. And so when we think about social norms, right, you see here on the second bullet point, this idea of like community, and the collective, and what is going to be best for the individual versus the collective. And I think that's part of it, is that identification of what works for our unique communities, and how do we sort of create social change, like maybe like we talked about, through use of certain terms or language, or even just sharing space and knowledge, right? That opportunity too. It doesn't have to be this huge, big, grand plan, but it's those ways that we connect with one another with meaning. So, for example, I mean, the 40 hour could be considered a part of that social change advocacy, right? It's an opportunity for us to take space and co-learn, and then share that information with others, and really sort of inspire or transform beliefs, right, and values. And tribal norms, as we know, are often rooted in ancestral teachings which can include elders eating first, right? Not stepping over things, making offerings of tobacco, pollen, or other practices, right? Related to harvesting, hunting, or even water, which we've talked about today, is just so important to us. And so we have the tools, really. We do. All of us have the tools to guide. And the question is like, how do we do this collectively? And using our Indigenous values, there's the answer. It lies in there. And I think to some degree, there's a lot of problems in the world that if we came together and we use those values, we might be able to come up with some different solutions. Can we go to the next slide, Debbie? Okay, so now we're looking at social norms, and we're kind of comparing like mainstream to like tribal social norms here. And so I think there's some consideration to be given to the fact that there are folks, not just in tribal communities, I mean, other communities too, right, that have the experience of having to walk in two worlds. We know that's our experience, right, that we've had to navigate the mainstream also. So learning to speak more than one language, navigating more than one set of customs, learning to code switch essentially, right? And this is a reality for so many of us. And so I'm wondering, just, sort of, you guys, we could do show of hands in the chat, or you can type something in there if you want, but how many of us have ended up in a room or a space where we're the only Native person and we've had to do this, had to sort of walk in two separate worlds? Yeah. Yeah, thank you guys for sharing, being vulnerable. Something that we have to do, right? To survive even. Yep. Thank you, Tori. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tyrell. Yes, thank you, Steph, right? If you go into a college that's maybe not a tribal college, if you're going somewhere else, like that's an experience that we have, right? And it can be challenging. I've had that experience too, where you have to sort of carve a path for yourself, but also again, right, isn't that part of this disruption of the social norms? Like, oh, maybe we don't belong there, maybe this isn't set up for us, but you know what, like we're going to take that knowledge and we're going to bring that back to our community, right? Don't we deserve that also, if that's what is a priority to us, if that's a way for us, right, to access information in that space? Absolutely. Thank you for that. And so you guys are wonderful. Thanks for sharing. And one of the things I'm thinking about is how do we navigate those spaces, right? Like, how do we voice our opinions while also being respectful and traditional, but then, not become tokenized, which again, like with the example that folks have shared with like, Shrina is saying where I graduated, I was the only Native student in high school, right? Yeah. And Tyrell, yeah, thank you for that. It can be especially odd when one is white passing and you have to explain your Indigenous self. I have that experience. So I appreciate you. I really do appreciate you saying that, Tyrell. That sort of comes down to like where you feel like, at least for me, I'm thinking to myself, I'm in this headspace of, okay, I have to worry about how others perceive me, so I'm perceiving how others perceive me, right? It's kind of exhausting. It's just, and then also recognizing, for me at least, I think a lot about the privilege of that too, right? That there are folks who don't, are more visibly, right? We have all these different sort of things about us, but like visibly have, if someone has a like visible disability versus invisible, or visibly, looks a certain way, folks automatically make assumptions, right? They apply, there's those stigma, those stereotypes, and sort of this landscape together really kind of boils down to our ability to ground ourselves, right, in our traditions and our cultures, and recognizing that it's not a competition, that there's room for all of us to do this work together, with our various tribal identities, and that we have to maybe push past that mentality that the colonizer has oppressed upon us of sort of scarcity of resources, right? And how do we, I think that that division is intentional. It is, right? And instead of being divided, how do we come together? So we see here that on mainstream, we have social constructs created to maintain, again, and keep that hierarchy intact, right? So that division. And we know that in Indian country, we're still fighting the hierarchy for the autonomy that we so deserve and need to be able to have the power to make decisions for our lands and our water and our people. And these are really relevant social change issues. But this hierarchy exists, right? And we have to acknowledge that in order to disrupt it, and to fight back. Yes, thank you, Shawnee. I wanted to voice what you said too, right? Like, we are enough to be here, to sit at this table with all of our different intersecting identities, right? That we're here. Yeah. Thank you for that. Absolutely. Yeah, and Carrie says social constructs at work, like expecting a person with least formal education, yeah, to clean, organize, run errands. Yes, yes. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that too. So our second bullet point here, right, is looking at how too often some of these social norms are really rooted in power. And again, like we just mentioned about the oppression piece, right, that we covered the other day. It's that fear and compliance, right? That divide and conquer. I was sort of reminded of like the political identity to be a citizen of a nation, and blood quantum, right? This sort of forced identity of like, here, you have to provide us with this. We need to know this information. But that's not part of who we are, to have that in our culture and our values, and that power is, that power would be essential to the creation of social norms. I think that sort of, again, is opposite of our Indigenous values, right? That emphasis on power, which really is related to, like we talked about last week, personal gain, right? And what that looks like. And so I think there's an opportunity here for us to really think more about the collective, and not the individual, and that this is sort of an opportunity for us to teach folks how to incorporate these values into the work. So again, tribal values, right? Like reciprocity, generosity, honesty, bravery, humility, sharing, sorting, guiding principles, that values of our community. So ceremonies, healers, doulas, these traditional values that help guide colleagues, and also the folks that we are working with who are struggling, right? And using our ancestral roots to connect and decolonize social norms. And really disrupting processes that lift up like lateral oppression, right? So that's something to really keep in mind when social change advocacy together, collectively. And then the role and purpose that, sort of emphasizing this role and purpose for each person's gifts and contributions, right? Isn't this really what, is like sort of centered to our Indigenous values, is recognizing that everyone has a story and experience, and that it's equally as valuable as the next, right? That we're all here on this earth for a short period of time, but that our contribution, whether some might perceive that as big or small or what have you, that it was significant no matter what it was, right? And how might it look if we all came together to do this work, to share space and employ our unique gifts towards sort of shared goals and purpose. Like, what might we be able to accomplish if we do that? Debbie, do you want to go to the next slide? Yes, thank you, Becky, for your comments. Just monitoring the chat too, so we can see what everyone's saying. But thank you so much for that. Yeah. Since it's Becky, do I have the thumbs up to share that? Is that okay if I read that? Yeah, we're okay. Okay. So Becky says, as non-Native American, I realized at one point how I turned to my good friend who is Native to explain issues, perspective, anything, right, related to anything Native American, as if there is just one Native American viewpoint, which was so unfair to her. She had her own opinions based on her own experiences, and basically racist of me, even though I thought I was attempting to be inclusive. Thank you for sharing this. That takes a lot of courage, bravery. And I think that there are definitely folks of us in the room who have experienced that, right? Sort of tokenism. And, I know for me, at least, when that's happened in certain spaces, I feel sort of a little bit powerless and silenced because there's a responsibility for me. Again, this is just my experience of really considering like the weight, like I talked about, of the words and the language and how I'm sort of representing like myself, my tribe, my culture, and it can be heavy to carry. And also if you feel like, well, I'm not the only person, right? Like there's others who have different experiences, and to sort of be spotlighted in that way, it for me feels uncomfortable, to the point where I shut down a little bit occasionally. And I think that makes it challenging because then there's this balance of like, no, I need to say something, right? This social change part, like it doesn't happen if no one shares or says anything, but then not wanting to misrepresent and say, no, I can't speak for everyone. And it can be difficult to navigate. So I really respect that you said that, because we don't all have all of the solutions or all of the experiences, right? So thank you so much. Okay, so now we are on, oh, good. Okay, so this can be a tough slide, but systematic destruction of tribal norms, right? So assimilation policies left holes in Native identity, worldview, and safe access to ancestral practices. We talked a little bit about this too, in the oppression slides, but everyone probably has an idea of how this has impacted yourself or maybe your tribe specifically. Thinking a little bit about like extractive industries, right? Elimination of lands, forced relocation. Also, again, like I mentioned previous slide, like things with blood quantum, and sort of systematic destruction, right? Woven into policies, like what we discussed last week with assimilation. And that's what we're fighting, right? That's what we're constantly fighting. And thank you, Autumn. Yes, some of us are tired and we continue to do the work because we want to pave that path forward for future generations. But yeah, it's a lot. So one of the things that I was sort of thinking about from that, we had a lot of folks relocated due to the missions. And we lost a lot of sort of ceremonial practices and over the years, especially gold rush came into the area, like directly where my tribe sits. And when we were put into rancherias, there was an allotment process. And when that happened, it did that divide tactic, right? We saw that strategy employed again. And it's had a lasting impact on the social, political, and cultural dynamics of my tribe. And it's really challenging. It's really challenging to navigate that. But sometimes I think there's an opportunity to bring people together and I'm always interested to hear about sort of the things that happen for other folks in their tribal communities, just knowing how sensitive some of this is and that we carry it with us. Thanks, Tyrell. Oh, wonder if we're related. Maybe we're cousins. So we're seeing here with loss of purpose, right? Limited opportunities to hunt and gather. So no access to our ancestral lands, being put on plots of lands, in my case, like rancherias, where we were previously roaming our homelands free, right? We didn't have this issue. We didn't have sort of limitations in terms of hunting and gathering. And then we see assuming other religions to avoid persecution, right? And we couldn't pray until 1978, right? That was restricted. You could be incarcerated or jailed for that. And also how that sort of played itself out with boarding schools, right? With residential schools and that forced assumption, like taking on other religions, right? We weren't allowed to practice ours. And then gender-based hatreds, homophobia, sexism, patriarchy and misogyny, which we talked about the patriarchy a little last week, but misogyny, hatred of the feminine, that was not part of our indigenous values and beliefs, right? We think about like sort of tribes that had like matrilineal structures, like this was not who we are. And but patriarchy and misogyny exist, right? We have to we acknowledge that so that we can disrupt it. And then we mentioned this a little bit earlier, but individualism versus tribal thinking, right? So resistance to traditional values, community living, codes of accountability, and sacredness of creation. So it takes a village, that's our way, right? So beading, quilting, sewing circles, maybe that's a space for folks to talk, right? And maybe that's where people feel safe. Maybe not in their homes, maybe not talking to people in position of power like tribal council that holds its own set of difficulties sometimes depending on who's sitting on the council. And maybe there's these conversations, right? These connections that we've talked about that are the way for people to come together, commune, and also really highlight the sort of issues and solutions in terms of social change advocacy. And really sort of the ultimate piece here, that resistance that we're talking about, like kind of formulating and is coming together, and having that shared space for wisdom and bravery and compassion. Debbie, you want to go to the next slide, please? So not our own teachings. So silence is learned, right? But it is loud. There's a tendency to stand by without intervening. Ignore, laugh at, or participate in sexist jokes or teasing. Victim blaming. She asked for it and deserves it. So I was sort of wondering, this made me think, what kind of silences do we endure? And even a little bit beyond that, like what silences do we maybe endure to be safe or feel like we're in a safe space? Like you think about what our elders have had to experience over their lives to be safe or secure or to access safety and security. And I'd like to think that we're really doing some work right now to change this today, to come together and focus more on our commonalities and our differences, and to be in solidarity rather than divided. But yeah, exactly. There's so many, right? Because the colonizers want us to be separate and divided. But yeah, I think it's just something I was thinking about, and I know others have some thoughts on this too. But our grandmothers and aunties fought so hard for us to be where we are today, for us to have our ceremonies back, for us to have shelters, and I think that we're at the point where we're raising our voices, right? And how do we continue this work forward? Yeah, thanks, Steph. So our grandparents would not speak to us in Lakota, and only whispered it to each other. Yeah, absolutely. not feeling like we can share our traditional languages, right, for fear of retaliation or retribution or what will happen if we do. And then denial. So failure to recognize that sexual violence is happening, failure to acknowledge we know who offenders are. Some thoughts I was thinking about here is like, this might be a tool for survival for some, right? Like recognizing that there's a safety component here too with denial. So there's a reason perhaps why folks are why this is almost kind of a protective factor for some folks in certain circumstances, right? And what might be something to consider is, how do we acknowledge denial at the different levels too? Because we can't say that denial is just individual, right? We're talking about individual versus collective too in this presentation, but like being able to move more towards the collective from the individual. However, denial happens not just to person, right? It can happen in a community. Also denial by our government, right? I think we know that that's a real thing. But how do we work to address this? And we're getting some really good comments in the chat, and I want to bring those forward. So when we see leaders or spiritual leaders perpetuate toxic behaviors, yep, and nobody says anything, absolutely, that's so true. Nepotism in the criminal justice system, lack of time for crime due to connections, yep, absolutely. Thank you, Carrie. Alexandra says, I think when language keepers or spiritual leaders cause harm in the forms of domestic violence or sexual violence, we oftentimes keep hush because those things were taken from us, language ceremony, that folks crave that knowledge and turn a blind eye to perpetrators that also hold those positions or knowledge. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And so we come down to our last bullet here. So again, you guys are bringing this forward. I love this. This all ties together perfectly, but reliance on criminal justice systems, right? To hold perpetrators accountable. So failure to create community deterrence, failure to define our own accountability. So yeah, the system is faulty. Carrie, you highlighted that perfectly, right? And so how do we change this, right? Keeping on the path of incorporating our Indigenous values, decolonizing, pushing policies and practices that really center our needs, the community's needs, the survivors' needs, and making changes, right, to adapt it to our needs. So the example I was kind of thinking of in my head, and feel free to throw in the chat if you guys have something else, but like SDVCJ, right, special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction, and changes to VAWA's tribal provision, and being able to prosecute, right, these crimes that are happening. Now there's a lot of things to be said about like that infrastructure that would be required to do this, but just having that be now sort of put into policy that was a lot of work for a lot of people, and just putting out there that we have that also now as an option. I think that was something that people worked long and hard for, but we made some progress, right? That's an example of it. And so thinking about like this failure to define our own accountability, right? Like, who are we empowering as advocates? Who do we know that causes harm, and how are we sort of denying or protecting, right? Like within families and communities too. Like, I think some of you have already talked about that too, but with like the nepotism and spiritual leaders, and just how are our values and our actions like aligned in terms of this social change advocacy, right? Are we protecting certain people? Why? Who should we be empowering and uplifting? And what do those spaces look like? And how do we educate? Yeah, thank you so much. So knowing the ways that we are told women had to hold perpetrators accountable are probably not okay in today's world, right? Banishment, corporal punishment. Yeah, absolutely. Debbie, can you go to the next slide, please? Oh, we're stuck for a second. Sorry, everyone. Oh, there we go. Okay, thanks, Deb. So we talked a little bit, right, just at the end there about educating. So trying to educate and use language, right? What is social change advocacy? So changing attitudes, beliefs, and responses within tribal nations and society might be educating folks around like what are urban issues, rural issues, issues on the reservations, teaching others who don't know our culture, connecting oppression to the root cause of violence, which we've talked about, oppression and the root causes of violence, but also thinking about things like political constructs. How do we disrupt those, dismantle them, decolonize them? For example, like reproductive justice, and then understanding how oppressive beliefs are reinforced again by those political constructs, right? Not just identifying them, but understanding really sort of how they came to be, and also thinking about like sort of community solutions, and also solutions right at the different levels, local, state, and federal. And then a venue for individuals, community, and institutions to begin the process of eliminating the layers of oppression we currently live in. So assimilation, poverty, racism, sexism, ageism, homophobia, addictions, incarcerations, child removal. So when we say institutions, right, going into like colleges and universities, or like tribal consultations, and affecting like these processes by talking about emerging issues and using these as opportunities, right, to educate and sort of forward like our needs, and to highlight that things are sort of, this landscape is constantly evolving, social change advocacy, and that we use those passions we talked about earlier to bring together the needs of the community, and also the how we can advocate for change, whether that's again at the local, state, or federal level, because they all intersect with each other. And when we say assimilation, right, we're talking about like we're not leaving people behind, and understanding like the impacts of poverty and racism, um, you know, and calling people into the work, and in our own homes and families, like what are we accountable for teaching new generations? Debbie, you want to go to the next slide? Okay, so water can carve even the hardest stones. So what are your passion projects for social change? And thinking about advocates as change agents, right? Like bridge builders. They are the water that carves away the stone of oppressive social constructs. We change lives, right? And many change agents have gone before us. So we talked about the aunties and the grandmothers and the work that they've done to build this movement, right? For over 40 years. So it's a long time, but also we have to start somewhere. And we have a responsibility to continue the work that they began. They have stepped into the river of activism to challenge damaging beliefs and practices, right? So figuring out a way to come together out of our different like faiths and beliefs. And an example of this is like when women from different backgrounds came together to create the first shelter, right? No matter what the differences were, like there was a common purpose and goal. Really was centered around the needs of survivors. And then every story we hear, right, from victims or survivors can be put in our basket to inform changes that need to happen. So every time we tell a story, we can make change. And it's so valuable when we know that these stories are like a real human being, a relative. And we uplift those voices in the work that we do. So, what are some examples of social change that have already occurred in our lifetime? Want to hear from some of you if you have some thoughts. Like, what do you think about this? What have we sort of seen or experienced? Yeah, VAWA reauthorization and Title IX. Yep. Thank you, Rose. Yeah, liquor, making marital rape illegal in more states. Yeah, absolutely. VOCA, Victims of Crime Act, money for tribes. Yeah, no fault divorce. Yeah, these are great examples. Changes to statute of limitations, right, to reporting sexual abuse. Yeah, thank you, Emily. Deb, can you go to the next slide? And we can read chats as we get them too, if anyone has anything else they want to share. Yep, a lot of MMIW legislation, most recently. Absolutely Not Invisible Act Commission work and report. Thanks, Rose. So decolonizing, the ultimate freedom, our spirit, our minds, our hearts. As we make the connections between sexual violence and all forms of oppression, i.e. the hatred of people deemed inferior, right? So hatred is part of this, this web of oppression, right? Where we say to people like, oh yeah, you gotta get over it. So how do we stand up against this and focus on self-love while we are decolonizing? That's something that's part of the process of decolonizing, right? Is knowing what this hatred looks like, and also saying how do we purposefully dismantle that, and creating a social and political movement that is rebuilding our communities, restoring our sovereignty, and ultimately working to end sexual violence, right? So restoring sovereignty is huge, especially when it comes to restoring our tribal identities, in terms of like sexual violence, right? And as we work to restore our tribal identities, values, and tribal ways of life, we restore that web of life. You want to go to the next slide, Deb? Okay, so we have a breakout room discussion, but for the sake of time, I think, Steph, if it's okay with you, we'll skip the breakout room discussion and I'll just go over the slide a little bit, and then maybe we can get a little bit of feedback from people if they want to share. What do you think?
That sounds good.
Okay. The next presentation I'm doing is much shorter, so it's okay if we kind of go into that, but the time, but I think this one will take a little bit longer because we have a pretty good group here. But so for the breakout room discussion, what we had sort of thought about is asking people to decide like what social norms you would want to impact in your community. So whether like how would you do that? Like what kind of an event might you create? And then thinking about maybe a slogan that you would use to draw folks in, and then listing some partners that might be helpful to have included in the event. And then how will you know that you made an impact? So if anyone has anything like a topic in particular, otherwise I can put up some ideas too. And you guys can unmute too. So if anyone wants to just do like one of the bullets and somebody else wanted to add on, like that's perfectly fine. Great. Thank you, Tori. So consent is sacred, honor consent. I made stickers to distribute at powwows with those slogans just to get people thinking, yeah, those are really amazing. Thank you for sharing that. That's okay, Rose. It's sort of just a discussion about like if we see there's a social norm that might want to change or impact in our community, like what might we have as like an event? Is that like a talking circle or a dance or something like that? Oh, Jessica has their hand raised. Did you want to go, Jessica?
Yeah, I can share about something that my organization does once a year to kind of challenge some social norms. So We hold an
Yeah.
event every fall. It's like a night of remembrance. So we invite the whole community to come, and we have speakers share about their experiences with domestic violence. And we have signs with folks who have passed away in the state of Minnesota in the last year from domestic violence and their ages. And it's really impactful to show folks, like, to almost normalize, like, domestic violence happens and it happens to your neighbors and it happens to your friends, and it's okay to talk about it and it's okay to seek help for it. And that's always very successful. So
Thank you so much. That's a wonderful example. And Rose is saying youth engagement about consent and healthy relationships. Yeah, absolutely. That's so important, right? Our work with youth. Thank you for bringing these forward. This is amazing. So I think what we see too, right, is that we're all different and at different times, like that sort of the ways that we might step into the space and come together to impact the community. That might be sort of a little bit different for each of us. So some folks do feel more comfortable maybe actively engaging in habits that might challenge sort of white supremacy, right? But also that there are opportunities for us to sort of support the work that people are doing and to ask them to step up in that space or to make room really for them to step up into that space. Because as some of you have mentioned earlier, there are folks who might not feel like their thoughts or ideas are important in certain environments, like in group meetings, or people who feel like their voices have been previously ignored, or they don't feel safe in certain spaces to sort of voice their concerns or their ideas. And I think it's just something we talk about too internally is like the way that we can share space and ideas. And part of social change advocacy, right, is challenging the notion that only some folks can or should contribute. And someone had mentioned earlier sort of this idea of, right, like degrees or credentials that might, you know, kind of also add to that, right? Like contextually, like, oh, well, do you have the experience that we need to, you know, to provide this feedback on this particular thing? It's like, well, you don't have to have that to be able to acknowledge that someone has unique gifts and values to bring, right, to this social change advocacy work that we're all doing. And can we go to the next slide, Deb? I want to make sure you guys get a good break today. So I'm like, I'm gonna try to get through these for you. Okay, so engaging the individual, right? Activism can help victims recover, but they alone will know when they are ready. So, they're more than just the experiences they have, right? Like we have sort of breaking down the individual and uplifting the collective, the community will make us stronger. So creating these entry points, right? And emphasizing that it is a process, but that we're not at the same place at the same time. We're all different at different times again. And so what might be sort of Western notions of like, oh, you can just go to therapy here. Oh, just be resilient. It'll be fine. Well, the harm on the individual in reality is as collective for us, for those of us who are practicing, right, like indigenous values. Like even though we might do all the things as individuals, we still care about how it impacts our community. We carry the experiences and voices and stories of our communities, our elders, and those that live in it with us, that resides within our heart. And healing might look different, right, for non-native folks. So for us, like success really does include family and our communities and our nations, right? And there's a disconnect between how we view. So sort of the next point, like maybe justice in like a compassionate lens, but also looking at like the roots instead of just focusing on consequences and accountability. And then considering how we can interrupt not just processes, but conditions. Like, how do we think about advocacy and social change and interrupting cycles of violence that our communities have learned, right? So, uprooting and purposefully like decolonizing. And we're all related, right? So we're related to each other, to the earth, to all the things. And we draw strength from these connections. So we have to continue to forge them to do this work together in solidarity. Those entry points are just so important for us to really engage in that social change, right? It's inspiring and healing. Can you go to the next slide, Deb? Oh, there's some great things in the chat for ideas. So I know we're gonna share the chat with everybody, but I love seeing what everybody's doing. All the work that you're all doing is very inspiring. Okay, so talking circle support and education groups. So the individual becomes a community, right? So now we've moved towards collective identity. So I don't know if anyone here has done or offers talking circles currently, but they have a time, a place, and a purpose, right? There's a feeling of safety and community without having to say all the things, you just say something, right? And there's connection there. You know that the people that you're with in the space, like they know what you're talking about. They see you, they understand you. And there's this power in being in circle together, right? So it's effective to reduce isolation and feelings of invisibility, like we just mentioned, to gain support from others. Again, like, okay, we have this connection together, right? To decrease self-blame, so important. And so it also provides an opportunity, right, to increase knowledge about dynamics of sexual violence. So what we talked about in the previous slide, right, like thinking about those root causes, that sexual violence was intentional and used as a tool of oppression. That's analyzing the impact of violence. Again, like we talked really early on about like the media and the presence of sort of the violence, and also just issues that are relevant to our social change processes, right, in tribal communities. And then utilizing elders to restore traditional teachings, lifeways, and values that will reverse the damage of social norms, right? Designed to divide and break us. So might be able to do that, for example, by asking knowledge keepers to come in and share knowledge about how to do or understand things, open up again those entry points for people to get involved in the movement. Even if that's that, again, someone had mentioned having elders come in, right, to tell stories and share their experiences. And as we breathe life into these words that we use, we dispel those stigmas and stereotypes and myths, and disrupt these processes about sort of what some consider like these secrets that we're supposed to keep, right? These dirty like secrets that no one's supposed to talk about. And but we're supposed to talk about them. We're supposed to come together. We're supposed to share in that the sort of the knowledge and the wisdom of our ancestors, right? And in order to really sort of to break the cycle, that we have to do that work. We go to the next slide, Deb. Yes, thank you, Jess, for saying that. Weekly grief and groups for elders, youth, women, caregivers with quarterly talking circles. Thank you so much. Yeah, love to see that. So Solidarity Shaw Project, right? A collaborative effort with Sacred Hoop Coalition to honor survivors of domestic and sexual violence, created sort of a tribal think, grew from this idea of a few where many from the community then became engaged together. So this included phone calls, emails, and discussions with many to determine sort of the color, purpose, and script for this project. And it became a public awareness tool, right? So red for Native people, teal fringe for sexual violence, purple fringe for domestic violence, and then requesting sort of honor songs for survivors at powwows and rallies. And then there's a picture on the next slide, if you'll go to that, please, Deb. Right, so it really was sort of centered around survivors, and they led the process of like, how are we going to choose what colors and who's going to sew? And, you know, there's the conversations where people came together, right, to create this sort of space and to come up with these ideas. And the men wore armbands So you can start something like this, right? Like some kind of art project or what works for your community. And Steph says we will be sending out the tools for this project. The follow-up email. Yes, thank you, Steph. And there might be other ideas that you all have too, right? So it allows us to use a different side of our brain in terms of social change advocacy, not just thinking, but doing and communing and all of those things together in that space. And it's building community, but it's an opportunity to have those conversations too, right? And to share. You want to go to the next one, Deb? Thank you. So, okay, we're going to put this out here, but we have a couple more slides. So this is sort of an exercise in changing social norms. And what does it look like to address social norms in our communities? There might be other examples, of course, right? But we're thinking sort of, what are examples of a response you might have to this situation? Like if you were at a powwow and the MC told a very inappropriate joke, what can you do? What might stop you from responding to these types of remarks? Or what are some unintended consequences or possibly even some risks, right? Feel free to unmute if you guys, if anyone wants to respond to this kind of question. You can type in the chat too. But what would you maybe do if you were at a powwow and the MC was telling inappropriate jokes? Unplug the mic. Thank you, Carrie. A good idea.
Hello.
Boo them. Okay. Yep. Go ahead. Did you have something you wanted to share?
Yes, one of the things that I've done is I visit with the MC beforehand. I think prevention is best in that setting rather than wait for it to happen and then react, kind of just remind them that in a time and era of missing and murdered Indigenous people, that we need to be sensitive to those things and sensitive to, other topics and subjects. So just to keep his or her jokes tasteful.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Being proactive, right? And like preventative is so important if we can. And I think to Alexandra, your point too, right? That in some spaces, in some communities, like there may be jokes that are made that the community itself is sort of maybe, I don't want to say necessarily accepting, I mean, it could, but also maybe turning away from, right? Like addressing, like, oh, it's funny, or I've heard jokes made about people's age. And I think that we know that that is definitely, this can make folks feel really, really uncomfortable and called out in that space, embarrassed. And I think that, yeah, that's a really great point about prevention. The other thing is that you can call people in, right? This is an opportunity to educate if it does get said. And sort of what does that look like, right? Like being able to say like, okay, no, like this doesn't work for us. This is not okay. We don't say these things, like, and recognizing that again, some folks might stay silent. And because oppression is part of an internalized process, right? Where folks might not feel comfortable speaking up for a variety of reasons. And so maybe there's an opportunity to talk to others in the space, to coordinate with other folks who are there too, who are like, oh yeah, this is not okay. Like what might, there, like you guys had said too in the chat, like that there are elders and children and other people here, that this is not acceptable to have these sorts of comments made, right? Yeah, thank you, Rose. So Rose is saying approach a member of the powwow committee too to share about the inappropriate comment or remarks, to hopefully have the MC apologize, right? Absolutely. And then provide them with resources. Yes. Yeah, thank you. This is Amazing. Yep. Thank you so much. These are great ideas. Okay, next slide, Deb. Is that okay? Okay, so again, large group discussion, right? So restoring the sacredness of all tribal members. There are grandmas and grandpas and aunties and uncles, family and friends, little ones who are willing to organize, resist sexual violence, and help change social norms. And what are the benefits of organizing community members, right? So not being afraid to disrupt, but also knowing that maybe perhaps some people who are closest to us, we may have to sort of challenge their perceptions by gently offering education, right? Or sort of having those hard discussions and trying to create that space of openness and sharing. Although some will be uncomfortable perhaps at first, but really being able to provide a space for folks to come together and be their true authentic selves, right? Deb, we go to the next slide. So when we think about moving into organizing spaces like planning events, it's important to be transparent and authentic about what you're trying to do. Like, what is your purpose? Talk about who you are, where you're from, why you're there, and why this issue is so important. Don't be afraid of rejection. And, many folks, maybe some elders might still carry the shame of their past experiences. So, received messages that silence them about sexual violence. We talked about that little in one of the previous slides, right? But we carry experiences then that some people may feel more safe in the silence, but also leaving space for those voices too. If people feel comfortable, maybe they will over time feel comfortable sharing or participating. And getting people involved, even if people are not willing to maybe speak the truths right away, being in space and community together allows people to have that purpose, right? That shared social change purpose that we're talking about, that people might have skills or different gifts that they want to contribute. Maybe that's not vocalizing something, but maybe that's being there and also learning, right? You're still learning even if we're not talking. And being really consistent, right? You don't want to lose accountability and trust. Debbie, we go to the next slide. We have just a couple more slides here, but so this is a picture of the Elders Lodge that Muzak was assisting with. And so just an example of, right, growing a sense of community and some of our speaker notes, we always say, like, if you can provide food, please bring food. Oh my goodness, that's so important. And Rose is talking about too, right? Having medicines for people to share, and often for first time, like medicines and healers. And yep, Jennifer's saying diversity of perspectives. Yeah, absolutely. Deb, will you go to the next slide? So institutional changes, what does that look like? You don't have to have this big elaborate plan like we talked about earlier. It could be incremental changes, right? Institutions are designed to maintain. So, being able to really look at the oppression that exists and thinking intentionally about the policies and practices that will help us to access and maintain resources and power. Sort of what does that look like, and how do we leverage our social change to be able to disrupt those systems and then also access those resources, right? Redistribute that power. And then practitioners knowingly or unknowingly contribute to these oppressive practices, right, that perpetuate violence against Native communities. So the role of the advocate then is to focus on behaviors of harm doers and carry the stories of survivors to institutions, where a thorough and culturally respectful response can be developed in order to change responses and influence social norms. Example of this, some folks probably have experienced this, but at certain clinics, perhaps, there's a door, right? There's the door, the main entrance. But is there a different entrance for folks who are coming in that are survivors of sexual assault? Is there a person who can provide the services that they need? Is there a waiting room? When folks are sitting waiting for exams, often takes hours. Is there an opportunity to have water? So, often you can't. If you're having a swab done, you have to wait to have the water. But is it possible to have that done before? Can we get them out swab while we're waiting and then be able to access that water that we know is being healing to us, right? And interrupting these barriers. It doesn't have to be this huge, big plan, but just the small ways that we're able to continue to advocate for the needs of the survivors and community. So will you go to the next slide? And then expanding our advocacy, right? Sexual violence impacts all of us in some way. Again, like we talked about, and with our Indigenous values, we're not just thinking about ourselves and individual, thinking about the collective, right? We carry those experiences, those stories. So this is across all spectrums of gender, age, right? And thinking about how so many of our male relatives have experienced violence. How do we expand to make sure that everybody gets the advocacy that they need to be their whole selves? That's part of that social change process, right? Want to go to the next slide, Deb? So again, thinking about sort of expanding our advocacy, we have some statistics here. The Justice for Deaf Victims National Coalition indicates that over 60% of deaf or hard of hearing individuals have or will experience sexual violence, maybe targeted because of communication barriers, lack of interpretation, most often victimized by family members, caregivers, or institutional personnel. Now, I'd just like to remind you again of when we talked about statistics in these oppression slides that this is based on reporting, right? So we know that underreporting is an issue when it comes to sexual violence in terms of being able to extrapolate really, really specific, accurate information. But this is just a way to highlight those who have reported, like what these what the prevalence looks like, and just thinking about the ways that people are targeted, right? And the more we learn about the different intersections and identities and issues, the better our advocacy can be. But also, right, when we're looking at things that involve numbers, it's important to remember that piece of okay, who's included, but who's missing from this information and why. And part of our social change advocacy, in my opinion, is that piece too, right? Is to think about the folks whose voices are not highlighted or included in. What are the reasons for that, and how can we understand their stories as well? And next slide, please, Deb. Just have 2 more slides and then we get a break. Thank you all for hanging in there. So food for thought. Social change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, education, perseverance, coalition building, right? Community organizing, all the things. And again, the main thing is it really doesn't happen overnight. We just have to keep showing up to the spaces, even when the doors get slammed, closed in our face, sometimes perhaps literally. And maybe even more important, especially when that happens, right? We're on to something here. And sometimes our families or communities, like we talked about earlier, might not want to talk about this stuff. And sometimes they might not be ready, but making sure that we're ready, that we're creating the space for these really important conversations, and just community to be together, even if some folks aren't necessarily ready, right, to share. And if community education, community awareness efforts focus solely on the impact sexual assault has on the victims, we are failing victims because our focus is on them and not the harm doers and the systems that fail them, right? So it's all the things coming together because they don't exist in a bubble, right? There's overlapping, so everything sort of overlaps and intersects, and and there's impacts all over. And so last slide, Deb. Implications for change. So we're looking at engaging systems and engaging communities, right? What can we do? Create policies that are reflective of our tribal values. Restore tribal values and lifeways by integrating and traditionally appropriate codes and policies, right? Into those different levels and aspects of tribal government, and also thinking about, as we talked about in my example a little earlier, right? Some of like tribal council, like there might be folks who don't feel really connected, but asking elected potentials, tribal council leaders, or really vetting folks who are coming into those positions and asking them sort of where are they at with their responses to sexual violence and what they might be willing to engage in terms of social change advocacy, right? That's can be really important. And we know that we might come up against folks who we feel are less active or engaged, but that's a potential area of change, right? Thinking about who those potential leaders are ensures that we have folks who are then elected that are really invested in these issues. And then engaging the community, right? Restoring community versus this idea of individualism that we talked about earlier, that's really promoted by colonizers. Community engagement is coalition building, right? So creating strong local supports to really foster change, and then integrating traditional life ways to restore wellness. And I think that's it, Steph. I think we're at a break.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Morgan. No, I'm really glad that we took a little bit more time on this one. I think this is an important module. I think we could probably do a 40-hour just on this module. So I appreciate you taking your time with that, Morgan, and communicating that in a good way. We have a 15-minute break. So please take some time, get something to eat, whatever you need to do. I will be back at 2:40, what, 8? Yeah, somewhere around there. 15 minutes. Sorry, I can't math right now. So take your time, please. We'll be back in 15. Thank you.
Understand sexual harassment differently based on our experiences. But I would love to hear from folks using maybe the chat, or if you wanted to unmic, what are some of your responses to these questions? Like examples of, again, sexual harassment, who you think can be or is typically sexually harassed, and does this show up differently for Native folks? Mm-hmm. Thank you, Becky. Yeah, general example. Male colleague commenting about how you look, right? Harassment can be comments about clothing, what a person is wearing, and or asking the person to wear more of a certain item, like short skirts, etc. Yes, thank you, Rose. Absolutely. Those are great examples. And so something to keep in mind too with sexual harassment is that sexual harassment, right, can be sort of targeted towards an individual, but the experience of sexual harassment too, like there's a witnessing aspect to this, right? Like some folks could be um, like kind of vicariously involved, like in the sense that they might overhear or sort of see the sexual harassment happening and then sort of thinking about at that point, right, like bystander response. Yes, we're getting some more examples here. So anyone can experience sexual harassment. Yep. One example that came up was inappropriate comments about someone that was braiding another's hair, implying sexuality within that context. Thanks, Alexandra. Fetishizing or feeling entitled to be inappropriate towards Native women and girls. Yes, thank you so much, Holly Elk. And then Rose says, can be asking about your sexuality. Yep, absolutely. Very intrusive questions, right? Like those types of comments or questions, preferences. Yes, thank you, Mercy. Yep, anyone can be sexually harassed. Not taking no for an answer in regards to going out or hooking up. Thanks. That's important too, Deanna. Yeah, absolutely. So I think what we're hearing too, right, is that with particular folks like that, sexual harassment could be at least to this question different for Native folks in terms of that historic to fetishizing component, right? Um, and how that sort of is involved in what we might need to know and how we respond, right? Yeah, thank you. So this is where aunties and uncles comments get tricky. Yeah, that is, you're right. That's something to consider. And Tyrell's asking if there's any more explanation about that. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide. Deb, do you want to go to the next one? Okay. So how are we defining sexual harassment in this context? So we're saying that sexual harassment is unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and or other verbal or physical contact of a sexual nature. And when submission to or rejection of this conduct explicitly or implicitly affects an individual's employment, unreasonably interferes with an individual's work performance, or creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. So these are issues that can be brought up to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, right, the EEOC, and then investigated. So behaviors of sexual harassment or favoritism, as some might see it, but that's one way, right, that it could be viewed. Folks from, who might be perceiving this from an outside perspective could be saying, oh, well, how come this person is getting this preferential treatment? But really, there's more to it, right? However, we can see here how in that example, it's impacting other people too, right? Like, so those colleagues that might be viewing somebody as getting favoritism or preferential treatment might then in turn also cause the ways that they interact with the person who is being or experiencing sexual harassment, right, in the workplace. And this can happen in anywhere, right? Any kind of establishment, especially where people get into positions where there's power dynamics, right? Hierarchies and authority, and where folks exercise that privilege and lean into those power dynamics. So there's sort of an opportunistic component here, but it can happen to anywhere, anyone, anywhere, and all the way up to the highest offices, right? And sometimes people might quit their jobs because of sexual harassment. They might feel obligated to do or perform certain things, because of fear of retaliation or because they can't quit their jobs. So maybe for some folks, that's not an option, right? For a number of reasons, whether that be related to safety, um, or even financial reasons, right? So, like in terms of maybe having to have that job because they have children to provide for, or they feel like they're not qualified for a different work, or this is a job that maybe they worked really hard to get, and they feel like there's limited opportunities for them elsewhere. I think that that can all also impact, right, responses to sexual harassment in the workplace when somebody is experiencing that. Want to go to the next slide, Deb? We see some couple of comments too coming through in the chat over here. Okay. Yeah, so I think there's a question too, like, right, like we're seeing some stuff about like what does it look like for folks in certain positions of power who are taking advantage of their status? So we have some comments about like aunties and uncles, and like what does it look like when you sort of have like these respected terms and like position maybe within the community, but then you know, some of the actions of folks are being minimized, right? Are not taken perhaps seriously or with the amount of like sort of, I guess, sort of, are we questioning people's credibility in that way, right? If they say something and it's a person in the community who folks know and sort of have I don't have a different sort of, I'm trying to think of the way to explain it, but have a relationship with, we're like, oh, well, we really, you know, like, oh, this person, oh, I'm so surprised. I think there's that element, right, where people are like, and then that sort of disbelief or not automatically crediting the survivor or the victim, like then creates, creates a lot of just feelings of like, oh, I'm not sure, right? Can I say something? Or, you know, because people really like that person in the community, and how are they going to be portrayed after? And is that going to come back to me? And what's that possible like retaliation, whether at the individual or work or community level, what that might look like to sort of call out, right? Or to say, this is my experience. Yeah, I think those are good things to bring forward. It can be a little bit tricky. Yeah, Tyrell, go ahead, please unmute.
I guess the reason I kind of wanted to have somebody expound on this is, are you saying that, you know, those comments, like aunties and uncles comments, just because it is such a common thing culturally among many Native communities to have people who are, even if not, you know, physically related, but being in those positions of kind of power and responsibility, and because culturally we're taught, you know, respect that those people just have, you know, respect automatically, is that kind of what people are regarding and saying that like those positions of power are being abused? Or is there something specific like that's it? Because that's just not a common term or phrase that I'm familiar with, like, you know, like, oh, this auntie or this uncle's out on the prowl. That's not something that I have experience with. So that's kind of just what I was asking people's experience and opinion, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really good question. I sort of see a couple of things at play there, but I would love to hear what other folks like have to think about that. And I also think like Tyrell, to your point, that like in certain communities too, right? Like that folks might be like working with or even like near folks who are basically like family, right? Or for people who are basically family, or even working for people who are, depending on, you know, what they have. So yeah, I would love to hear a little bit more about what folks have to say about that too. So please unmute if anyone wants to provide some more context. I will say, Tyrell, to your point too, I think there are people like this idea that's like kind of being put out in the chat, right? Of like, like what we talked about before with like stigmas, right? And like the creation of those social norms. So I see this kind of like coming into the conversation in the sense that like there might be people in the community who it's like, oh, you know how they are. They just say those things or something like that too, right? And like, what is like, oh, that's, we know so and so that they just have like that kind of mind or something. And like kind of what that does. I know within my own family, I can only speak from my own experience. There were people where like they were like that, right? Like I knew that they had like that they thought or they acted or they said things a certain way, whether those things were racist or they were sexist or they were all the things, right? And it was like, okay, well, that's like how they are. And like, okay, that's how they are. Like, why? But how is that? You know, like there's a thing of like, how is that sort of what we're accepting or even just turning a blind eye to, right? Um, but I do think that there can be some of that like normalizing you know, so to speak, of certain like actions or comments or behaviors, and then it's sort of like um, that becomes part, right, of how we view maybe somebody in the community, but also what they're able to maybe even like kind of get away with and saying, even if it's just vocal, like verbal expression. And then the question of course is like how does that sort of manifest itself and it's impacting folks, right? And then if that becomes sort of like, okay, well, we know that this auntie or uncle or person is like this is sort of their way of saying things or doing things, like I mean it becomes a little bit tricky if it's like that's how that person might, you know, interact with others. And I think that yeah, and I would definitely be interested to see. I think it's a much larger conversation about social norms and just like our cultures in general and differences in different communities. Because, like we talked about, some communities are at a different, you know, sort of space with the way that we are able to discuss issues and the work that's being done. And I see this as sort of part of that too. That those things might sort of, you know, where everybody's at with awareness on sexual harassment, right? And these things is going to be like different depending on sort of the environment and also like where the community sits in terms of having those discussions and dialogue and even creating like having that space, right? And then I can imagine that if there's someone in a position of power that like uses their that sort of power and influence and maybe they make suggestive remarks or right, because we're talking about how this can go all the way up to the highest levels of power, right? What does that do if that's somebody in a leadership role, and how does that impact the community too? So I think there could definitely be a lot of ways that we could, you know, sort of look at sexual harassment in the workplace and the way that it sort of operates across different sort and intersects with, you know, different levels of, you know, the community and also the different workplaces and just like the culture and sort of like environment. But I think, yeah, I would love if folks sort of chimed in, but maybe it's a conversation that folks can connect on too as we move through the 40 hour. Maybe there's other space for that also. Yeah, I see some folks are talking about like in particular, uh Matthew's asking a question about does anyone feel it could be harassment if a person is sexualizing themselves? Um, like purposefully drawing attention to themselves or trying to get attention from a coworker, however they're doing that, like whatever that expression is, right? Might not just be clothing, could be the words that they're using. Says I have witnessed this in a hospital setting and it is very disruptive. And then Jess says, or in a role of youth teen leadership, right, as an enter adulthood. Um, yeah. And then Holyoke is saying that there is a huge shift in adjusting to how social norms are evolving so quickly in this era. I feel like the older generation is trying to adapt And there are some that are interested in learning and growing, but there are many that are simply set in their ways and uncomfortable with change. It definitely is something that contributes to a situation of that's just how they are. Yes, thank you for saying that much more eloquently, I feel like, than I was, but absolutely right. It's I've seen that a lot too. And it's sort of like, okay, so what is the role of advocates and our ways of understanding and being where we can really decolonize actively, but also part of it is going to about back to what you're talking about, right? With youth, Jess, and like us being able to educate and inform in future generations, right, on what these issues are and how might we proactively engage folks to converse and also identify and respond, all the things. So, what is sexual harassment? Forms of sexual discrimination that violate, Title 7 of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, behaviors with a sexual or gender demeaning connotation, unwanted, right, and cause discomfort or intimidation. Quid pro quo, so employer asking an employee or an applicant for a sexual favor in return for employment or some job benefit, or a hostile work environment where a supervisor, a coworker, or a customer might make unwelcome sexual comments or suggestively touch or act in a sexually inappropriate way. Deb, will you go to the next slide? So the Minnesota statute here says that sexual harassment includes, again, unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, sexually motivated physical contact, or other verbal or physical conduct or communication of a sexual nature when submission to that conduct or communication is made a term or condition either explicitly or implicitly of obtaining employment, public accommodations or public services, education, or housing. Submission to or rejection of the conduct or communication by an individual is used as a factor in decisions affecting that individual's employment, public accommodations, or public services, education, or housing, or that conduct or communication has the purpose or effect of substantially interfering with an individual's employment, public accommodations, public services, education, or housing, or creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive employment, public accommodations, public services, educational, or housing environment. Okay, go to the next slide, Deb. So now we're going to talk about, now we have sort of that legal definition. We're going to talk about the effects on the victim. So,
can you guys still hear me? Sorry, I had like earbuds in and for background noise, and they sort of just died out. So if you can't, just let me know.
I think we can hear you better without the earbuds.
I was more worried, like, because of the background stuff. I was
Oh,
like,
no. Okay, you're
yeah.
good. We can hear you.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so effects on the victims, right? Some of the effects that we might see on victims and also possibly witnesses. So this can include like biopsychosocial, right? So emotionally, there might be some effects, mentally. So what they could be depression, could be anxiety, could be folks who feel like, yeah, no, I can't be in this environment, right? It's like personally, I've experienced sexual harassment before, so that anxiety is real for folks who are perhaps for whatever those reasons are that they need to be there for, financial or, like I said, other reasons, and just constantly feeling like you're in fight or flight. It's really challenging. And then that, of course, can impact your self-worth. Like, how did this happen? Why did this happen to me? Like, what did it's sort of to your point, Matthew, sort of thinking about like when you're on the other side of that, right? Where it's like, what could I have done differently? Could I have done anything differently? why was I targeted? Like, what vibe was I giving off? Like, a lot of those things I know I thought about. And then if it's somebody that you respect, that and you didn't anticipate it happening too, like not somebody where you're like, oh, that person, I've heard comments that they do or say certain things, but like completely when it's also like out of the blue, right? Those are two things to consider too. Like, is this someone who's continuously causing this harm? Like, how can we address that? And then also that there's a potential, like we talked about, that this can happen to anyone. Well, it can also happen, anyone can be the perpetrator as well, right? The person that causes harm. So just thinking, that too, that people don't always present themselves right in a way that a person would be able to identify that person was unsafe, like very, very much can cause some of that anxiety and questions of safety, and sort of also related to like, right, the physical. And then again, we talked about sort of the economical, right, like that impact. Like if I leave this job, like what will happen? Like, will I be able to pay my bills? Will I be able to find a job? Like there are some communities that aren't a plethora of jobs available to everybody. Maybe someone's afraid of losing their healthcare benefits. There's all kinds of things that folks might be sort of on the fence about, like leaving or exiting a job, even though they maybe experience sexual harassment. And then again, also productivity, right? Like can't work, or I can't focus, I can't do my work as well. And then other folks, like I talked about in the other slide, like that might be thinking that this is favoritism somebody is, sort of receiving, not realizing that perhaps this is sexual harassment, and that other folks could think that the survivor is to blame or is getting like these benefits, right, from this unwanted attention. So the recipient defines or identifies whether or not they have experienced this sexual harassment, and it is not dependent upon the intent of the actor. Okay, so common responses to sexual harassment. So comply, right? Some folks might comply, not say anything, and this might be viewed as consent, but it's not. So maybe folks don't know what to say, and they might sort of, folks, like examples of it would be like putting up with it, or sort of jokes. And then another thing too that could be a response folks might have is reasoning. So trying to explain, right, like thoughts or feelings, or trying to understand and rationalize, like, why is this happening? But it's not okay. It doesn't matter how we sort of try to reason with it, right? Like it's occurring, it's illegal, it's not acceptable. And then working around, so trying to avoid the offender might be looking, like, for example, the survivor or victim might be looking at their schedule and moving things around to try to avoid working with this person. But then what happens if they do this and they are losing hours, or they are losing money as a result of having to sort of avoid working with this individual, right? So that could be something that could come up as a sort of effect, right, of their response. And then attempting to leave. Oh, actually, we missed one here. Challenge. So confronting the offender, like head on in this example, right? So maybe they're like, I'm gonna go straight to the person who is causing me harm, and I'm gonna say, like, okay, here's how I feel, or how I think, or how this is not acceptable to me. Sort of I see this as like trying to challenge that power imbalance. I don't know how other folks like feel about that, but it's almost like, okay, you're trying to take, right, my autonomy and my agency and like my ability to be here and to work, and I earned this job, and like, okay, so maybe somebody's feeling those things, and they're like, I'm gonna stand up for myself, right? I'm not, this can't happen. And maybe that's something that people do right away, or maybe that's something people sort of do you know, like they're balancing like, okay, how much do I maybe need this employment versus, all right, I'm going to say something because I just can't do this anymore. Like, this is not okay for me to be in this space. It's not safe, and it's not okay. And then attempting to leave, right? So then maybe the next step is then also like looking for another job, looking for other employment, trying to leave this environment. And then inviting intervention. So that might be talking to coworkers or telling other people, managers, directors, and trying to get support from folks. So that maybe the outcome would be that the person who is causing harm is asked to leave, right? Or there's some sort of consequences that are applied to that individual instead of the person who's experiencing the harm having to make the decision to leave. So in terms of, will you go to the next slide, Deb? We just got like 2 more slides. Sorry about that. It's the one for advocacy strategies. Thank you. So in terms of advocacy strategies, we have talking with the victim to explore what they want, what their needs are, informing the victim of laws in the appropriate jurisdictions, their rights and options, safety concerns. And so when we say safety concerns, sometimes the person causing harm might be like close with the survivor and thinking about how we can help advocate for thinking about like, thinking about how we might be looking at things like again, like what we talked about on the previous slide with like working around like rides and scheduling and all of that. Because, you know, for example, what if the survivor victim is, you know, sort of what if that other individual has control of the schedule and schedules them to close at night with them, for example, whatever the environment they're in, right? And they're the only 2 people there. That makes it really, really tricky. So if they can sort of address safety concerns by maybe having someone help advocate, right, for thinking about how to work around that. And then taking into consideration time limits to file charges. So in Minnesota, we have 180 days for state and 45 days for federal. And then providing support and accompaniment as needed and requested. Advising the victim to keep all written records, right? So that includes things like emails, text messages, perhaps social media conversations, maybe screenshotting those documents, and especially if there's photos or videos. And then part of this also would include like assisting with filing complaints, right? This can be really important. We might not have all the words to talk about the experiences, right? So survivors might not have, they might not feel like they're in a place to really be able to fill out a complaint without some assistance. So being able to provide that can be really crucial. And our job too, also, right, is to meet survivors where they're at and to provide that support and help when it's needed. So also filing complaints with the Minnesota Department of Human Rights or the EEOC or whatever your state entity is. You can hire private attorneys. That might be a strategy. And then alternate strategies to immerse survivor as well. Deb, you want to go to the next slide? And then we have website resources here. So you guys will all receive copies of this, I think. And these resources, the website links will go directly to the sites. So you guys can take a look at these. And then last slide, please, Deb. So implications for change, right? So systems change might mean assisting in enforcing sexual harassment laws within tribes and states. Sexual harassment laws are not always equitable. So taking that into consideration. And like we talked about previously, that could be part of that social change advocacy work, right? So now we're looking at that social change, raising awareness about sexual harassment in the workplace, and identifying those behaviors related to sexual harassment, right? I know folks, we've talked a little bit about like proactive, preventative. So part of that educating, right, could be that. And also, what does that look like? These conversations that we're having are amazing on the chat, because they're really bringing up these sort of crucial intersections that we see taking place in Indian country and in tribal communities, right? And bringing those to the forefront of these conversations about how we raise awareness proactively, and also educating, again, community and tribal responders in the work that we do with sexual harassment and social change. And I think that's it. That's what I had. Is there any questions or anything? Steph, I think it's back to you.
Thank you. And look at that, we're right back on track. What are we thinking? Do you want to take like I know we just kind of had one, but should we take a 10-minute break or push through? First person in chat, I'm gonna follow your instruction. Break. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back here at 3:35. Thank you. All
So I
right.
have an hour to try to get through privilege information and confidentiality.
Yes, ma'am.
Again,
What's that?
again, I'm gonna have to try to rush through it. Like, there's so much to it. I don't know if I'm gonna even be able to
There
touch on
is,
all
and
of
if
it.
there's anything that we miss, we're going to be sending the slides, and there's a lot of appendices and supporting materials for this module. So if there's something that you feel like we're kind of like rushing, breezing too quickly through, we don't want to skip anything, but if there is something that you feel like we could have touched on more, a lot of that information is going to be in the materials that I'll be sending tomorrow morning.
Okay.
All right.
I actually think this one should have been all by itself.
Yeah, you're probably right. There's a lot of information to.
Yeah.
Also, I wanted to let everyone know that Ingrid, are you on?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes. Ingrid Anderson's also a part of our team, and she's here to kind of help out too. And but I wanted the folks to let you introduce yourself to them, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Good afternoon. My name is Ingrid Anderson. I am the National Policy Director for MUSEC, and that means a lot of my work is focused on community kind of grassroots organizing and some activism, some legislative advocacy, and a lot of policy advocacy. And pardon me, I'm running low on water today. So I'm going to be here to support Deb and Steph as they present this incredibly valuable information to you all. But I also do want to share that I have a long background in direct service and advocacy, both at child advocacy centers, victim witness assistance in a systems-based office, and in a DVSA program. And so I'm also all ears to answer any questions or facilitate any conversation about the larger picture of our work and the space that we share together. It's an honor to be here with you all.
Thank you. All right.
So, hi again. My name is Debbie Bush, and I am the TSAS TA provider for MUSEC. I too have direct service in sexual assault and domestic violence. So we're going to talk about policies and procedures, and I'm going to try not to rush through because there is a lot of information. And again, I want to be respectful of our time and end at 4:30 as we said we were gonna. So whatever I don't get to, Steph will be sending out the PowerPoint presentations, and it has a lot of information in it. So if I don't get to everything, I do apologize in advance. So I do want to say that throughout the 40 hours, you will be understanding more policies and procedures and practices and how those guides help advocates in their roles to keep victims safe and secure. So, whoops, I'm doing my own slides and I still didn't get it right. Okay, so the goal is to introduce common organizational practices, policies and practices used in advocacy programs. And the objective is to understand laws and practices related to confidentiality for advocates. Identifying common organization policies and practices that provide a framework for advocates to do their jobs. And this is really important, especially, especially in tribal communities where everybody knows each other. So confidentiality is the key to the success of the victim services programs. Okay, so the cornerstone for safety is confidentiality. It is through our confidentiality policies that the strengths we show in enforcing these policies that women and children feel a sense of sanctuary. Women as sacred beings have the right to expect protection and safety atmospheres. So in the slide, it always is going to say women and children, and I just want to clarify that it can be anyone that is sexually assaulted, and that it's important that, like it says, the cornerstone of the safety for the victims of sexual assault is the confidentiality. Okay, confidentiality is defined as the assurance that the access of information regarding a woman utilizing program advocacy should be strictly controlled, and that any violation is not only a breach of faith, but the potential to threaten the safety of the life of a Native woman, or like I said earlier, any victim that was sexually assaulted. So I'm going to go through some of the definitions a little quicker so that we can get more into some of the discussion parts. But when you're defining confidentiality, it is really important to stress that the importance of the controlling the information. So that means any personal data that would identify the survivor as a victim. So that means birthday, name, address, how many kids, anything that could allow somebody to identify the victim. And the other thing we got to remember that, like I said, in tribal settings, it's smaller. They might be a family member that's coming in, and you might see other people, or you might see them in the community. So the confidentiality is the foundation of how you're going to build that trust so that you can provide services to the victims. Okay, so privileged communication is different. An exchange of information between two people. So that is the advocate and the survivor. And in that communication, it's privileged because you are getting confidential information related to the case, what happened, what details, if there was substance abuse, if it ever happened before, like all these important intimate details. Especially, you're going to probably hear what happened to them, how it happened, and where it happened. So that survivor's story, and that is their confidential information, and they are sharing it to you in a privileged communication. Okay, so there are three types of communication. There is the private, there is confidential, and there's privileged. And we will go through all three of these. But when you're talking about privileged, sometimes with privileged communications, that you cannot be subpoenaed to court. Ingrid, am I correct on that?
Yes, so
Okay.
there are always nuances, right? And full disclosure, I am originally from Minnesota, but I have done the majority of my direct service here in Nebraska, way, way, way out west in Nebraska. So things are a little different out here. But like with doctor-patient confidentiality, if records are subpoenaed, if you're called to be deposed, those, at least out here, and again, consult with your attorneys because I'm not offering legal advice. A lot of legal process supersedes the privileged, like advocate confidentiality. And so, what I've seen a lot of folks have success with, like in our DB and SA programs, is having really robust internal processes to protect information, where it's not discoverable through subpoenas and that kind of thing. But to your point, Debbie, all of this hinges on a shared understanding within your organization about how you're going to handle information, how you're going to communicate to best protect the people that you're trying to serve.
Yes, and I'm so glad she brought that up, because that is the important part. And that is why it's really important that the organization has policies that the advocates can follow, so they know their boundaries within each category, so that they're protecting themselves and their clients. Because there are things that if somebody, of course, reports child abuse, or they're going to harm themselves or others, or I just drew a blank. There's three of them. If you're going to hurt yourself, you're going to hurt someone else, or if there's child abuse, most places you are mandated reporter, and that has to be reported for the safety of not just yourself, but the victim that you're working with. So that is one time where even you have to report that kind of stuff. But we are going to go to, oops, sorry.
Sorry, Deb, I just wanted to note something that was mentioned in the chat about the privileged communication within the county attorney's office being different than what a community-based advocate is held to. And I think that just really speaks to how important these internal conversations are to set the standards or the expectations for you and your team, as well as the people that you're serving. So thanks for bringing that to light, Brenda.
Yeah, and I will get into more community-based advocacy and ways that you can like protect yourself so you aren't getting subpoenaed into court. But again, they have to be policies within your organization. So that will be coming, but thank you so much for that question. So Minnesota statute 59202. Obviously, I can't read, and it's late in the afternoon for me. To ensure communication is privileged, a sexual assault advocate must meet all of the following: undergo at least 40 hours of sexual assault training, work under direction of a supervisor in a crisis center with a primary purpose to render advocacy to victims of sexual assault, and 3, generally cannot be compelled to testify about any opinions or information received from or about the victim with whom they are working. And honestly, so this is for Minnesota. So on this slide, there is a link, and it has all other states you can look up to find your statute of what it is in your state. I can't actually do the slides and look at the comments. So if there is comments, can somebody just let me know?
Yep, we'll keep track of them for you.
Okay. So. Okay, confidentiality in federal court. So many organizations. Okay, I missed a slide. Sorry. Nope, I didn't. Okay, so I'm gonna just tell you that a lot of with this, there's also different stuff under federal regulations. And many people have federal grants along with state grants. So it's really important that you follow, look at the VAWA confidentiality laws, because VAWA's confidentiality laws and the HIPAA laws are different. And like I said earlier, in the confidentiality law, you cannot identify anything that would identify the victim. So if I was working in a tribal setting and my chief called me and said, "Hey, Deb, is Sue Smith in your program?" I would not be able to tell the chief, even though they're above my position. I could not tell them that they were in my program or I was seeing them, because that would be a breach of confidentiality, because they are not directly involved with the program. So a victim service program has a time released release of information. So okay, I'm getting ahead of myself now. So what I was trying to get to is that it's really important that I don't think the VAWA is on here, but you should look up the VAWA laws and their confidentiality, which is most of the time in your special conditions of your federal grants. And it will give you a layout of what victim services programs are supposed to follow. The VAWA is the strongest protection to ensure victim rights and confidentiality among all the other ones. Except again, with the mandated reporter, which is child abuse or neglect. If the survivor is threatening themselves or someone else, then obviously, again, you would have to report it. So here is what we were talking about, communications. Advocates may disclose information received about a victim, from a victim about the victim unless one. So the victim's signs a release of information and gives consent. Mandated reporting, which I explained, there's 3 different situations for that, and a court-ordered compelled disclosure. But again, that goes back to if you put in policies regarding subpoenas and how an advocate should respond to a subpoena. And in a couple slides from now, we'll be talking about that. Once you bring in a third party to your privileged conversation, it is no longer privileged. What does that mean? If I bring in a third party? Is anybody writing in the chat stuff?
Yeah, somebody just put the police or DCFS.
Okay, so if you were in a meeting with them and the victim, anything that would be said in that meeting would not be privileged. But, okay. So confidentiality. So the FISPA, Family Violence Prevention and Service Act, 42 USC 104002 A2E statute talks about confidentiality. The VOCA Victims of Crime is another statute. 42 USC 10604D. And then you have the VAWA, which was in 2007, and it's the 42 UC 13925. And all of those are federal requirements. So it's really important when you're doing your policies on confidentiality that you look at these and adapt them into your policies so that your advocates are following what the guidelines are for confidentiality. Okay, so there, okay. Personal identification. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this. It's the name and the address, contact information, which is like phone number, address. It could even be your grandmother's phone number or your grandmother or mother's number, social security or date of birth. Information that would identify the victim. And like I said before, if she has 6 kids, and one of those kids has a unique name and that name could identify her as a victim, then even that is needs to be confidential. Everything, anything and every, I guess it's easier to say anything and everything that could identify the victim as a victim of sexual assault should not be identified. So that's even like, I know everybody does intake forms, and a lot of people are starting to use tribal databases. So when you're using a tribal database that's within your tribe, you have to be really careful that your victim service program is not hooked into the tribal data system where I'm in accounting and I push a button and all the people that are working, or all the people that are getting services from your program come up with all their identifying information. And maybe their case notes. That is a severe breach of confidentiality. You could lose your funding for something like that. VAWA requires informed consent for release, and it's usually a time limited one. And VAWA does have templates on their website for release of information. And when I say time limited, usually it says from a certain date to a certain date, and then sometimes it'll say at the bottom 30 days after not active in the program. So that means that's done. Okay, consent or statute or court order compel and release of information. Victim must be identified. Victim must be notified of any impending disclosure. And then again, the mandated reporter and the threat of harm to self or others. Okay, advocates have responsibility to inform their clients if the privilege community that they have the right to privileged communication, and the victims have a right to say they waive privileged communication if they want, and it's up to the advocate to let them know what that means, because that means they could be compelled to testify in court and disclose intimate conversations about the incident of sexual assault. So it's really important to have open and transparent communication with your survivors, and to let them know what privileged communication is, and how they do have the right to waive that privilege if they choose. If victims consent to having advocates testify, some victims might want their advocates to testify, so they can sign a waiver, so that the advocate can go to court. But there are a lot of risks with that, because once that advocate is on the stand, any questions could be asked. You know, what, like, I'm just saying, I'm gonna just use these as examples, you know. Was she under the influence? Did this ever happen to her before? Does she know this person? So it could really harm the victim. So it's really important as an advocate that you explain the pros and cons to all that, and that confidentiality and it is a way to protect the victims. That's what we're doing, is we're trying to protect them. And we're not like lawyers, and so they should let their lawyers do that stuff. We're just there to be supportive and empower them through a difficult time. Okay, so here is a large group discussion. So if people could put it in the chat. Okay, what can you say or do to assure a victim survivor that what they say to you will remain confidential? Especially, I want to just say, especially in a tribal community. Just because we have small communities where we're all related. So how do you build that trust with the person you're working with, that they know that you won't breach their confidentiality? How do you build that trust? How do you ensure them? Is there a policy in your organization that where you would go over a confidentiality statement with them? Okay, so what I see is some programs do have confidentiality statements that they go over with their clients when they come in. Okay. Okay, and so Carrie said that she comes right out and lets them know about the confidentiality and that she is a mandated reporter. Okay, so that, and I know it sounds like a baby step, but that is the most important step, right? What can we say or do if you are tempted to tell a friend, relative, or partner confidential information? I mean, to me, that is one of our discussion questions, but if you're in this field as an advocate, developing a trust reputation, signing intakes, yeah. How would you feel if one of your coworkers, I guess I'll ask that question instead. How would you feel if one of your coworkers said, "Oh my God, I almost told my partner last night who I was working with today"? What would you do? Yeah, the old standard, I cannot confirm or deny what you were asking me. I had this one, I was working in a shelter and I had somebody drop off a client and called 5 minutes later and they asked if the client was there. And I said, I cannot confirm or deny. And they're like, I was just there 5 minutes earlier. So I just stuck to, I cannot confirm or deny, right? would you feel comfortable with reporting somebody in your organization if they breached confidentiality? And how much damage could breaching confidentiality do to your program? Yeah, shut it down. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so the other thing is like I said, we live in small communities. So what happens when you go to the store and you run into a victim? Or somebody you're working with? What do you do? Yeah, you have to act as if you don't know them for their safety and wait for them to speak to you first. Yes. Because most of the time, everybody knows who the advocates are in your community, right? So
Yes.
if you're at Walmart and you're talking to me, then, oh my God, Debbie must have been sexually assaulted because she's talking to the sexual assault advocate, right? Not that maybe we're related or anything, but yes.
I would like what I do if I see I wait and see what type of like how they're approaching or how they're you can read body language, but I mean I say hi to everybody. Hi, how are you today? Oh, what a nice day. Look, it's cold. Oh, look, the sun's shining. And that's what I do. And I wait, see how they approach me if they or I just say hi, and carry on in my own little life. You see by their body language, right? Also, right? You read their language. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yes, I do. And the other thing that I like that somebody wrote in the chat, and I didn't see the name, sorry, because it goes by too quick. But they said that they would talk to them in the very beginning when they first came in, and would say, if I see you in a community, if you don't approach me, if you don't say hi to me, then I'm not going to say hi to you. Sometimes, that's a good way to do it too. But everybody has their own style. And like I said, yeah, and like I said, it all goes back to what your policies, what kind of policies you have in your organization that addressed all these different scenarios. Okay. Okay, I just write yes or no. I asked them for respect. We speak only in office. Oh, okay. So I just want a question. Does everybody know their confidentiality or their policies and procedures around confidentiality, privilege and privileged communication? Every mandated reporters? Yeah, okay, everybody does. Okay. 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 Okay, good. I'm so glad to hear that.
I think it's also important for us as advocates and people who work in this, admittedly very difficult field, to keep in mind that's not just for victim safety, but also for our own mental and emotional stability. You can't have that on you all the time. You can't constantly be thinking about that. And sometimes you need to just be able to remove yourself from the work. So
Yeah, I agree. And the confidentiality is to protect the advocate too, because a lot of advocates in small communities use their own cars to transport. What happens if somebody sees your car and you're alone? Then you're at risk of becoming a victim. So it's really important that you have policies on do you take the tribal car Or what kind of vehicle do you drive? Do you go with two people? Like all those kind of things to protect not only the victim that we're going to assist, but our advocates. Because it is a hard job, you know, and we are going and seeing people, you know, seeing people sometimes at their worst. And how do we protect ourselves too? And the other thing is, okay, so we're bound by confidentiality to keep all this stuff inside. So how do we heal ourselves, or how do we get rid of that secondary victim? I know I talked about that before, that we are secondary victims as advocates because we're carrying everybody else's stuff. So how do we let that go? Yep, self-care. How do we prevent burnout and protect ourselves at the same time? Yep, self-care. I don't know how many of you, I know I said this before, ceremonies, good, boundaries, yep. I don't know how many of you have the TSAS grant, but under the TSAS grant, there is a place where advocates can use the funding for clinical therapy for themselves so that they can, you know, of course, not the names, but dump the stuff that they carry every day. So I just wanted to let you guys know that. Vacations, yes, taking those vacations is important for self-care. You know, oh, no, I'm too busy, I can't. My clients need me. Okay, well, they need you to be healthy too. So it's really important that we do that. Yeah, it's trauma fatigue is real. Yep, it really is. And that's why policies, I mean, I know I'm going over like the basic confidentiality policies and stuff, but the whole important part is that policies are important and they guide the advocates and keep those boundaries so that we don't get burnt out or, you know, yeah, or, you know, not able to do our job. I like what Janie wrote, having a team to tag team in and out when it's too much, right? You need support, right? Workspace gives us a longer lunch to work out. Yeah, exercise is a good way to do that. Okay, so the release of information, like I said before, it should be limited to a person and an agency and a purpose. Okay, it should be limited for duration of time. A new release information must be signed once time is limited. Yes. So it's always like you give yourself a beginning and an end date, and then like usually on the bottom, way on the bottom, it will say like 30 days after or 60 days or whatever your agency says, that the release of information will be no longer good after they have, you know, not been in the program for so long. Okay. Advocates must specify how much information will be shared. The one thing I used to see all the time is, and don't get me wrong, I did a few times, say I was working for drug and alcohol or something, and I would write ACDP, mental health, you know, and so who in mental health? Like, does that mean I could talk to anybody in mental health? So you really have to be exact on who they're giving you permission to share information with. Okay. So the other thing is, okay, so if I go on a crisis call tonight and I'm working hand in hand with the cop that went to the thing, and the next day the survivor is now my client, now I need a release of information to talk to that officer that I was working with last night. Okay, So, so it's always important to make sure they know all the information about who the release is for, what the purpose is for, and how long will it be. And survivor must acknowledge and understand the risks and benefits of signing the release of confidential information. Victims informed about, you know, if their signatures, if it's, you know, okay, so depending on your policies for your agency, some can revoke their right to the release of information orally or written. So it's really important to know what it says in your policy, because some policies will be only written, will revoke the release of information. And you always have a signature and a witness. Okay. Okay. How can they be problematic? Required programs to violate federal and state laws. So, okay, so here's the subpoena part. So if your program has a policy on what happens when you are, like, what happens if you get a subpoena? Do you accept the subpoena? Do you have a lawyer that is works for your tribe or your program? So requires programs to breach contract with state. These are the problematic. Against public policy, violates program policies, hearsay. So that's one of the things about the privileged conversation too, and why they're saying that, like with community-based advocates, it's more of a hearsay because they're telling you what happened, but you don't know, you don't have the evidence or the facts to know what else happened in that situation. You're just hearing the story from the survivor, you know. So there are different ways to not be subpoenaed to court. And one of the other things with community-based advocates is that it's really important that when you're doing your documentation, you might just do intakes, or you might keep logs, like when you called your client, if your client came into the office, but you might not keep case notes, because case notes could be subpoenaed to court. So if you have every detail of what she told you in those case notes and they're subpoenaed to court, then that could be read in court. So it's really important to keep that as brief or non-descriptive as possible. Community-based advocates, however, are not required to complete case notes, and they must complete a 40-hour sexual assault training in order to protect under privileged communication laws. So that's really important to know. Like I said, some organizations will use intake forms, and then some organization will use like client log activity forms. So what kind of documentation do you guys keep in your organizations? Subpoenas go to the director and then they can be forwarded to the tribal attorney. Okay, that's good. I keep dates and servers provided. Okay, Shelley, can you just give us, like, you mean like if it's an accompaniment or something, is that what you're talking about, services provided? Yes, okay, okay. So you're just documenting the services that you're providing. Okay, okay, yes. Okay, so the other thing is being prepared for a subpoena. Okay, so like I said, management and documentations, advocates and volunteers, everybody should know the policies of what happens if your program is subpoenaed. We use variations that serve we provide, such as court accompaniment under advocacy. Okay. We track the hours worked and if we provide mutual aid. Okay. So everybody's like doing brief so that if I was gone for a month, somebody could pick up my clients and they would know what services they were provided, but they wouldn't know about the sexual assault that occurred because the notes are brief so that they can't be subpoenaed to court. Okay. So, okay, I'm just going to read this being prepared for subpoena. Advocacy programs can be prepared to provide when, if a subpoena is issued by having policies and practices in place. Program supervisors must be clear, understanding about confidentiality and privilege and release of information and ensure that staff are trained in this area. They have a responsibility to enforce good record keeping practices with a designated person to track and keep records and should ensure that all policies are reviewed and approved by the if you have chiefs, whoever has to approve that. And then it says policies should be reviewed yearly with all staff and victims should be provided a copy of the policy. And I'm just talking about subpoenas, like not all your policies about confidentiality and all that, okay? Programs should have a policy for the destruction of records. Minimizing policy should include never accept a subpoena for someone else. If a subpoena is for a woman or victim, do not confirm nor deny, and instructions to inform the direct supervisor and to call an attorney. So those are all the steps that are important when you receive a subpoena. Most people in this training are community-based advocates, right? Yes, okay. 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 Okay, so documentation and policies. Adjusting policies around documentation to confirm with confidentiality limitations in states. So again, like we said, take few notes, you know, and that's just to avoid being subpoenaed. Create policies about information which should be documented and which should never be documented. What about warrants? Okay, so can you, I'm not sure what about warrants. Same with warrants, if it's not your job to serve those warrants. Okay, so are you saying that the cops are coming to you with a warrant for your victim? Like, I don't understand. Can you unmute and just? I just don't understand the question of the warrant.
Hello,
Hello?
can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, the reason I asked about warrants because I had a issue one time at our shelter where the federal marshals showed up at our shelter. I stepped outside to meet them because they surrounded our shelter with the other cops and the CI looking for a woman. I asked to see the warrant. He wouldn't show me, but he flipped it in front of my face and then down. We argued outside of the shelter because I wouldn't let them in because the warrant didn't state the building, but only the person they were looking for.
Okay, so I'm not a lawyer, so, and I know I'm being recorded, but technically, when a victim is at a shelter, that is not their residence. That is a
Yes.
shelter. That is not their permanent residence. So I would personally get in touch with your legal department and then write up a policy on that, because that's a temporary housing unit. It's not a permanent residence. And then, of course, you always go back to that. I can't confirm or deny, but I know how police are, because the same thing has happened to me a few different times. But it is really important to have some kind of policy in place regarding that, because it would fall under the same kind of stuff as the subpoena. Like what policy do you have on if a federal, So what did happen?
After arguing and it just got really bad, it came to the point where my supervisor, the director, finally came out and I told him what was going on. He goes back in and they call the tribal attorney, which later she calls back to say, "Well, let them in the building," which to me is still wrong because the actual warrant doesn't say to go into the building, only for a person. I held my ground where I almost went to jail, but I did what I had to do and the income was ugly. So after that, it never happened again, but still, the situation occurred unexpected, so I don't know.
I was gonna say exactly what Pam just said. Them going into that shelter breached everybody else that was in that shelter breached their confidentiality.
Yeah,
So you standing your firm ground, but I mean, I understand it didn't happen again, but it might be really good policy and practice to have something written. So that if it does happen, this is, you need to call my you know what I mean? Like, and
Yeah.
really everybody needs to be on the same page, and they need to understand the vow of confidentiality, and that could be a breach of the whole shelter.
yeah. I understood that. My supervisor didn't because he was new.
Right.
Second, and the third thing is I was ready to battle for this lady.
That's an
I don't
advocate.
know,
That's a community-based advocate right there, right?
right?
And yeah, so there, yeah, I would, I think that's really important that we're talking about that, because it might not happen today, it might not happen tomorrow, but it could happen. And that's why it's really good to have policies and procedures in place for every case scenario. And I'm like running out of time, and I have 3 minutes left, and I don't want to keep you over, but Shelley says too that they have on their intake, they have a question if they have warrants or not. But I mean, if the girl needs to, or the whoever needs to be in there, but I think that you followed what you believed, but it would be really good if it was written, because then if you have a different director next time, you can say, look, the policy is right here. I followed the policy to what it says. You know, like we talked about how it's important that policies give us boundaries and help us do our job, because you got to remember that the job is so hard as it is, that the more structure that we have in place to protect us, is it makes our job easier, which I shouldn't say easier. It just makes it know what direction, and having everybody on the same page is awesome, because yeah, that could have been a whole breach of confidentiality to everybody in the, and I just want to say, and I know I brought it up before, like if you have a, like a lot of shelters might have monitor systems in their buildings. So if you have a monitor system and it's hooked up to like another building, like at the tribal council where security watches it, if those security officers aren't a part of your victim services program, then them watching your facility, seeing who's going in and out of your program, is a breach of confidentiality. Can anybody tell me why? They don't have privilege. Yep. Yep. And remember the vow of confidentiality. So if you get a chance, please pull it up, because the vow of confidentiality is all your federal grants. You could lose your money if you breach a client's confidentiality. And by having somebody monitor your program from an outside source, not inside your program, is a breach of confidentiality. Because there is recording proof that people can come to for help, and that would be a breach. Yep. Yep. Yeah. Is there any more questions? I mean, Steph's going to be, the only parts we didn't really get is advocates' responsibilities, ethics, which is really important. And we kind of talked about boundaries, which can go with ethics. And policies and implementing for change. So we missed like 4 slides, but like I said, it will go out. If you have any questions for me, you can always ask me next week, on Thursday. Thank you for listening. I hope that the information was valuable to you. I think it's a really important part of everything we do, because of course we want to build a program where victims feel safe to come, and that they know that we are protecting them at every step of the way. So now we'll go.
Thank you, Deb. And I'm sorry we did run a little late on that, but I am gonna send that like we said. And I should send that in the morning. I just have to wait for it to like tether or whatever it does. Takes like 3 hours. So that's why I don't get out to you right away. But we will be staying on after for an optional debrief. If anybody still has any questions about this module, we would love to continue discussion. But with that, we will see you guys on Thursday. Thank you.